No one in that small hospital room expected a cleaner to speak, least of all the bride. A wheelchair creaks against the floor. The man in it, his face pale, stares at the blank ceiling. His wedding ring glints oddly cold on his finger. The bride's voice cracks. "You've become a pathetic cripple." She spits out the words. Her words echo. The cleaner, quietly mopping near the corner, pauses, looks up, and says something the world will never forget. "Excuse me, ma'am," he begins softly, his voice firm, "but I see a man in here who still deserves respect." Before we unravel this powerful story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. But how did it all come to this moment? A wedding shattered, a man broken, and a cleaner about to speak truth to power. Ethan Parker used to be the kind of man who made promises with his whole heart. He believed in forever. 2 years ago, on their honeymoon drive, a drunk driver crossing the median changed everything. He woke up weeks later in a hospital bed with no feeling from the waist down. The doctors called it a life-altering spinal injury. His fiancée, Claire, was by his side. In the beginning, she cried, held his hand, whispered, "I'm with you." But as the weeks turned into months, love's burden began to bend under reality. She had to manage the finances, the home, her dreams, and now this new life. She told him she'd stay for better or worse, but somewhere along the way, she meant only for better. Ethan learned to feed himself, to wheel across the room, to swallow shame when strangers stared. At times, he would lie awake at night and think, is she thinking of ending this? He never voiced that fear. He told himself he was imagining things. 6 months in, Claire's patience frayed. She started walking out more. She'd say sharply, "This isn't the life I signed up for." Once, she slammed a glass down. "You think your pain makes you special? You're just a burden now." Ethan stared at her, shocked, silent. A year later, the wedding date came. Claire insisted they still go through with it, maybe out of guilt, maybe hoping something would change. The ceremony was brief. Claire's smile looked forced. Ethan thought, "I'm marrying a ghost of a promise." Then came tonight. He was recovering from a minor surgery. His pain was flaring. Claire arrived furious about something trivial. Words escalated. She shoved past nurses, stormed into his room. He watched her face redden, heard her voice crack. The break came when she said, "You're useless." The cleaner, Mr. Harris, had been there all shift. He was humble, kept to himself, never asked questions. But he heard. He wiped his mop slowly, turned to them. "I've mopped floors in bigger messes than this, and I can see that underneath his pain, there's still a man worth more than your anger." Claire stared. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. The room went quiet. In that instant, the balance shifted. The words acknowledged his dignity at a place that tried to strip it away. From there, the story spirals. Claire leaves that night. Ethan's world shrinks. He sinks into depression, resents his own body, tries to vanish in grief. Mr. Harris becomes a kind of guardian. Visits, brings small things, listens when Ethan's nights are too dark. One night, Ethan receives a message. Claire's pregnant. Mixed blood, the timeline wouldn't lie. He confronts her. She denies. She claims it's a stranger's. A paternity test says otherwise. The betrayal burns. Ethan, torn, weeps. Then comes the twist. Weeks later, Claire has a miscarriage. She claims she's sorry, says she was scared. She wants forgiveness. Ethan is caught between rage and sorrow. He asks, did she love me, or only the idea of me? Months later, Ethan rebuilds. He starts a support group for people after spinal injuries, meets others, speaks out about dignity, pain, and the right to be seen. Mr. Harris is there at his side at the first gathering, applauding when Ethan speaks. Claire disappears again, a text saying she's moved, she needs space. Ethan reads it, burns it. In the final scene, Ethan wheels himself into a room full of people like him, faces bruised by life, eyes bright with fight. He tells them, "You are not defined by what your body can't do. You are defined by what your spirit never gave up." He pauses, looks out. The camera lingers. "If you were Ethan, would you forgive Claire or walk away forever? How do you treat someone in pain? Would you look past the surface or see only what you wanted to see? This is not a tale of villainy. It's a mirror." Daniel had always been the kind of man who believed that hard work could shape destiny. At 31, he had built everything from the ground up: a small construction business, a modest home on the edge of town, and a heart that loved deeply and honestly. He was ambitious, warm-hearted, the kind of man who helped his neighbors fix their porches on weekends and still remembered his mother's birthday every year without fail. To him, life finally made sense, and the center of it all was Alyssa. Alyssa was the kind of woman who turned heads when she entered a room. Beautiful, confident, the life of every social circle she touched. She came from a family that measured success in appearances: polished smiles, expensive gowns, perfectly curated lives. Yet beneath that polished charm, she wanted something more: to be adored, envied, and seen as perfect. When she met Daniel, she saw a man with potential, someone real, grounded, genuine. He wasn't rich, but he had dreams, and she thought she could grow to love that. Together, they were the picture of promise. Friends called them the couple that made love look easy. Wedding invitations went out early. The venue, a vineyard overlooking rolling hills, was booked months in advance. Daniel poured his savings into the perfect day. Alyssa picked every detail with care: the flowers, the dress, the music. She wanted her wedding to be remembered not just by her, but by everyone who ever doubted her. And Daniel, ever devoted, smiled and said yes to every choice she made. He thought love was about saying yes. Then there was Rosa, the quiet cleaner who worked at the same hospital where Daniel's mother had once stayed during her illness. Rosa was in her late 40s, a woman whose presence was often overlooked. Her hands were rough from years of labor, her eyes soft with empathy. People rarely remembered her name, but she remembered everyone. She saw things others ignored: the tremor in a patient's hand, the exhaustion in a young nurse's eyes, the look of loneliness in people pretending to be fine. Rosa believed in kindness, even when the world wasn't kind back. As the wedding drew closer, Rosa occasionally saw Daniel at the hospital when he came to visit an injured worker from his construction site. He would bring food, sit for hours, ask how they were doing. Rosa would watch from afar and think, "That's a good man." One afternoon, she told him quietly, "You've got a kind heart. Don't let the world take that from you." Daniel smiled and thanked her. He never forgot those words. Alyssa, meanwhile, was consumed with perfection. Every morning was a checklist: the photographer, the caterer, the guest list. But sometimes when Daniel would talk about their future, the family he wanted, the quiet life they'd build, she would zone out, imagining something bigger, shinier, more glamorous. She wanted to be seen, adored, admired. And though Daniel loved her with everything he had, she was beginning to crave something his devotion couldn't give her: attention from the world. On the night before their wedding, Daniel couldn't sleep. He stood by the window of his small apartment, staring at the moon, smiling softly. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "tomorrow my life begins." He didn't know that by this time next week everything would be different, because sometimes the greatest storms come with no warning at all. The morning of the wedding was beautiful. The sky was clear, the guests filled with laughter. Alyssa looked radiant in her gown, her every movement graceful, rehearsed. Daniel couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle. He thought to himself, "I'm the luckiest man alive." When the vows were exchanged, Rosa, who had been assigned to clean up after the event, stood quietly at the back, watching the couple promise each other forever. She smiled faintly, perhaps knowing something that no one else did, that forever is never guaranteed. Later that evening, as the sun began to... A week before the wedding, Daniel felt like his whole life was falling into place. The suit had been fitted, the rings were ready, and his mother's words still echoed in his heart. A good marriage starts with a good heart. He was driving home that afternoon, the sky dimming under heavy gray clouds. The radio hummed softly, an old country song about love lasting forever. The roads were slick with rain, but Daniel didn't mind. He had driven this route 100 times before. He smiled to himself, imagining Alyssa walking down the aisle, picturing their first dance. Life felt safe, predictable, good. Then, in one heartbeat, everything changed. A blinding flash of headlights appeared from the opposite lane. A pickup truck swerved wildly across the median. Daniel gripped the steering wheel, heart pounding. The tires screeched, the car spun. A sound like thunder ripped through the air, metal on metal, glass shattering, and then... silence. The world went dark. When Daniel opened his eyes again, he was surrounded by blinding white light. The smell of antiseptic filled the air. Machines beeped softly beside him. He tried to move. His legs refused. Panic surged through his chest. His voice cracked as he whispered, "I can't feel my legs." A doctor leaned over, calm but grave. "Daniel, you were in a serious accident. There's been a spinal injury. We'll do everything we can, but right now, it's too soon to say how much function you'll regain." The words felt unreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. He turned his head, searching the room, and there she was. Alyssa, perfect hair, flawless makeup, eyes empty. She forced a smile that didn't reach her face. "You're alive," she said quietly. But even in her voice, he heard something missing. Warmth. In the days that followed, Daniel clung to hope. He told himself this was temporary, that with therapy and time, he'd walk again. But deep down, he could see the change in Alyssa's eyes. She visited less often. Her phone buzzed more than she spoke. When she did talk, it was about the wedding, not him. "Maybe we should postpone," she said one afternoon, eyes fixed on her manicure. "Just until things are... stable." He nodded slowly, hiding the pain. "If that's what you think is best." But when she left the room, the tears came. He stared at his legs, still, motionless under the blanket, and whispered, "Please, just let me walk again." He prayed every night for strength, for a miracle, for her love to stay. Meanwhile, Alyssa's world was shifting. Her friends whispered behind her back, "You're still marrying him? Girl, you can't throw your life away for that." She laughed it off, but those words lingered. When she looked at Daniel now, she didn't see the man she'd fallen in love with. She saw responsibility, confinement, a life smaller than the one she'd imagined. And that scared her more than anything. Rosa noticed the change before anyone else did. She'd see Daniel's hospital door half open, Alyssa sitting silently in the chair, scrolling on her phone, her body turned slightly away. Rosa would sweep past quietly, pretending not to hear, but her heart ached for the man lying in that bed, the man who still smiled when people came in, even when pain was written all over his face. Weeks went by. Daniel's condition stabilized, but his future hung in the balance. The doctors spoke gently but directly. "The injury is severe. There's a chance of improvement, but we can't promise mobility." He thanked them, nodded, and waited for Alyssa to say something comforting. Instead, she just stared at the floor. "So, you might never walk again?" she asked softly. He nodded. She said nothing more. That night, when she thought he was asleep, Alyssa stepped into the hallway. Rosa was mopping nearby, the soft hum of her radio filling the air. Alyssa's voice was low, tense. "I can't do this," she whispered into her phone. "I didn't sign up to be a nurse. Everyone's looking at me like I'm the bee." In the beginning, Alyssa's visits were constant. She arrived every morning, smiling through the pain, pretending to be strong for both of them. But slowly, her presence began to fade like a photograph left in the sun. First, she skipped a day, saying she was exhausted, then another because she had errands. Before long, Daniel found himself staring at the door each evening, hoping she'd walk through it, only to fall asleep to the sound of his heart monitor instead. The nurses noticed. Rosa noticed. But no one said a word. The excuses piled up faster than his recovery. Alyssa told her friends she needed space, that it was all too much. And her friends, the ones who never liked Daniel's simple life, wasted no time planting poison in her ear. "You're too young to be tied down like this," one said. "You deserve better," said another. And soon, Alyssa started to believe them. She started to imagine what her life might have been if that car crash hadn't happened, if she'd chosen differently, if she'd waited. Those thoughts became the soundtrack to her guilt. When she looked at Daniel now, she didn't see her fiancé. She saw a reminder of everything she'd lost, the parties she'd skip, the pictures she'd never take, the life she thought she deserved. And instead of love, pity began to take its place. It was a slow betrayal, not one of cruelty, but of neglect. The kind that doesn't make a sound, but leaves scars all the same. Rosa noticed before anyone else. She'd been mopping near Daniel's room one evening when she saw the vase on the windowsill, empty. The bright lilies Alyssa used to bring had withered days ago. Rosa stood there quietly, then slipped away and returned with a single white rose she'd bought for herself earlier that day. She placed it gently beside his bed, whispering, "No one should feel forgotten." Daniel woke later that night, saw the flower, and smiled weakly. For a brief moment, it gave him hope. But that hope shattered a few days later. It was late afternoon, sunlight filtering weakly through the blinds. Daniel was half asleep when he heard Alyssa's voice in the hallway. Her tone was low, impatient. "I can't do this anymore," she said. There was a pause, the faint sound of a man's voice on the other end of the line. Daniel froze, listening. Then came the words that tore him apart. "I can't marry someone in a wheelchair." He felt like the world had stopped spinning. The monitors beeped steadily beside him, cruelly indifferent. His chest tightened, tears filling his eyes. Every promise, every "I love you" she'd ever said suddenly felt like a lie. The walls of the hospital room felt smaller, colder. He turned his head toward the window, away from the door, and let the tears fall silently. When Alyssa walked in moments later, pretending nothing had happened, he couldn't even look at her. "You okay?" she asked softly. He nodded, forcing a weak smile. "Yeah, just tired." She left soon after, saying she had a meeting. But when the door closed, Daniel broke. He wept until his voice was gone. Rosa heard it all from the corridor. She wanted to go in, to say something, but she didn't. She knew some pain needed silence first. Instead, she sat by the nurse's desk, her heart heavy. She'd seen this kind of heartbreak before, the kind that doesn't heal easily, because it comes from love turned cold. He thought love was unconditional, but to her, it had terms and conditions. Days turned into weeks. Alyssa's calls became text messages. Then, even those stopped. Daniel's body healed slowly, but his spirit did not. Every morning he'd stare at the ceiling, replaying every memory of her, the laughter, the plans, the promises. And each time, it hurt more. But somewhere in the darkest corner of his hospital room, someone else was watching. Rosa. She saw his quiet strength, the way he tried to smile at nurses, the way he thanked the doctors even when he was breaking inside. She saw something worth saving. Something. In the quiet hours of the night, when the hospital hallways were empty and the sound of the machines hummed like distant thunder, Rosa was always there. Her footsteps were soft, almost invisible, but her presence lingered like a prayer. She had been cleaning that floor for years, long enough to know that some of the deepest stories happened between visiting hours when no one was watching. Daniel's room became part of her nightly routine. She'd check the floor, straighten his blanket, and sometimes, when she thought he was asleep, whisper a quiet blessing before she left. Rosa began leaving little notes, small pieces of folded paper tucked under Daniel's water cup or beside his food tray. Simple words, written in neat cursive. One day at a time. You are still more than this pain. Your story isn't over yet. At first, Daniel thought the nurses were leaving them. Then one evening he saw Rosa slipping one onto the table before she turned to go. They help, he said softly. Rosa smiled, her eyes warm but tired. Words can hold people together when everything else falls apart, she replied. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer pity. She just listened. When Daniel needed to talk, when silence was too heavy to bear, he would tell her about Alyssa, about the plans they made, about how love could turn to emptiness without warning. Rosa listened with the patience of someone who knew what it felt like to lose everything and still have to wake up the next morning. Over time, Daniel began to notice the difference her quiet presence made. When she entered the room, the air felt less heavy. He didn't know her story, but he could sense a strength in her, a kind of peace that only comes from surviving something you never thought you could. One night, as she refilled the sanitizer dispenser, he asked gently, "How do you do it? How do you stay so calm in a place full of pain?" Rosa paused, her back still turned. "Because pain taught me how to listen," she said. Then she added quietly, "And listening taught me how to live again." Rosa had seen too many people give up. She had watched families walk away when things got hard, seen laughter fade into silence, promises vanish into thin air. But something about Daniel, his kindness, his quiet endurance, stirred something inside her she hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was because she saw a reflection of herself in him, someone who had been left behind but still refused to stop believing in the goodness of people. Few knew anything about Rosa's past. The staff only knew she'd come to the hospital nearly 15 years ago, alone, asking for any job available. No one asked why, but sometimes, when she stood by the window looking out at the night sky, there was a certain sadness in her eyes, the kind that spoke of love lost, of promises broken. She'd once had a husband who was everything to her. A factory accident had taken him away too soon. She never remarried. Since then, she had learned to live quietly, to find peace in helping others find their own. The world had once called Rosa weak. They were wrong. To most people, she was just the cleaner, invisible, replaceable. But Rosa had something many had lost, compassion without expectation. She saw the things others missed. When a nurse looked frustrated, she offered a kind word. When a patient cried quietly, she left tissues beside their bed without a sound. And with Daniel, she offered the one thing he hadn't received in months: genuine care without condition. One morning, she noticed him staring out the window, silent tears streaking down his face. The sunlight poured through the blinds, painting faint lines across his skin. Rosa placed a note on his lap that simply read, "You're still here. That means something." He looked up at her and whispered, "Why are you helping me?" Rosa smiled faintly. "Because once, someone helped me when I thought I was finished too." The hospital staff didn't notice their small exchange. The day that should have been filled with music, laughter, and vows began with rain tapping against the hospital window. It was supposed to be their wedding day, the day Daniel would say, "I do," the day Alyssa would walk toward him in white, the day 2 lives would become one. But instead of a church, there was a hospital room. Instead of flowers, there was the sterile scent of disinfectant. And instead of love, there was silence. Daniel sat quietly in his wheelchair, dressed in a plain hospital gown, staring at the ring still sitting on the tray beside him. He had looked at it every day since the accident, a small circle of gold that had once meant forever. His hands trembled slightly as he turned it between his fingers. Outside, the sky was gray, almost heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. Then, the door burst open. Alyssa walked in, still wearing the wedding dress she had chosen months ago. Every fold was perfect, every sequin gleamed. But her face was cold, distant, almost unrecognizable. For a moment, Daniel's heart lifted. He thought maybe she had come to tell him that love was stronger than this, that she was still his bride. But the words that followed crushed that hope completely. "I can't live like this, Daniel," she began, her voice sharp, trembling with frustration. "You're not the man I agreed to marry. You're broken." Daniel's lips parted, but no sound came. He looked at her, his eyes pleading. Not for love, but for understanding. He wanted her to see him, the man who had once made her laugh, who had built her a home, who had promised her everything. But all she saw was the wheelchair. Rosa was in the corner, quietly mopping the floor. She froze but didn't look up. She'd seen harsh words before, but something about this moment felt different, crueler, heavier. Alyssa's tone rose, her anger growing like a storm she couldn't control. "Do you think I want this? To spend my life with someone who can't even stand next to me? Everyone's been talking, Daniel. They all pity me. They all say, 'Poor Alyssa, marrying the cripple.'" She stepped closer, her hands trembling. "I can't do it. I won't. You've become a pathetic cripple." The words sliced through the air. Daniel didn't move. He didn't shout back. He just stared at the floor, his face pale, his eyes distant. The monitor beside him beeped steadily, indifferent to the heartbreak unraveling before it. The silence that followed was sharper than her voice. It was the kind of silence that filled every corner of the room, the kind that suffocated. Rosa put the mop down slowly, her fingers tightening around the handle. For a moment, she simply stood there, her reflection faintly visible in the polished floor. Then she took a step forward. Her voice, calm but steady, broke through the heavy air. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said softly, her accent gentle, words deliberate. Alyssa turned, startled, eyes flashing with irritation. Rosa's gaze held firm. "I've cleaned these halls for 14 years, she continued, "and I've seen pain, the kind that breaks bones and the kind that breaks hearts. But what I've never seen—" She paused, her eyes flicking to Daniel, then back to Alyssa. "What I've never seen is a woman so blind to the gift she once had." Alyssa frowned, her voice trembling with anger. "You don't know anything about us." Rosa shook her head slowly. "I don't need to. Love doesn't vanish because life got hard. It vanishes when people choose pride over compassion." She took another step closer, her voice now unwavering. "You see a man in a chair. I see a man still fighting to stand, not on his legs but on his heart. And that kind of strength?" She looked Alyssa straight in the eye. "You'll spend a lifetime searching for it, and you'll never find it again." The room went still. Alyssa's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. For the first time, her confidence faltered. She looked at Daniel, truly looked at him. And what? For a long moment, no one spoke. The air hung thick with tension, the kind that makes even the walls seem to listen. Alyssa stood there, her wedding dress shimmering under the harsh hospital light, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. Daniel sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the floor, his chest rising and falling in slow, uneven breaths. And then Rosa, quiet, gentle Rosa, stepped closer. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. Truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. "You see a cripple," she began, her tone calm but steady. "I see a man who survived, a man who still breathes, still fights, even when life tried to take everything from him." Her gaze flickered to Daniel, then back to Alyssa. "You call him broken because you can't see the strength it takes just to wake up in this bed every morning. You say you can't live like this? Then maybe you were never really living at all. Alyssa blinked, stunned into silence. Rosa's voice grew softer, but somehow even stronger. The only broken thing in this room is your love. The words seemed to freeze time. Alyssa's lips parted, but no sound came. Somewhere down the hall, a heart monitor beeped steadily, a quiet reminder that life goes on, even after hearts are shattered. The nurses outside the door had stopped what they were doing. They listened, wide-eyed, to every word. It wasn't just what Rosa said, it was how she said it. There was no anger, no judgment, only truth wrapped in the kind of grace that comes from surviving your own battles. Alyssa looked around as if searching for something to hold on to, but there was nothing left to say. Her perfect dress, her perfect life, none of it could shield her from the weight of those words. She turned toward Daniel, her expression softening just for a second, as if realizing too late what she had done. Then, without a word, she turned and left the room. The click of her heels echoed down the hall like fading thunder. Silence filled the space she left behind. Daniel didn't cry, he didn't shout, he just breathed. For the first time in weeks, he lifted his head, slowly, deliberately, and looked straight ahead. His reflection in the window stared back at him, not as a man ruined, but as a man still here. The corners of his mouth trembled. A tear slid down his cheek, but this one was different, not from sorrow, but from release. Rosa didn't move closer. She didn't comfort him with more words. She simply picked up her mop, wrung out the water, and began to clean again. Her movements were quiet, methodical, as though restoring order to a world that had just fallen apart. When she finally turned to leave, she paused at the door. "You're stronger than you think," she said softly. "Don't ever forget that." Then she walked away. No applause, no drama, no one chasing after her. Just a woman doing her job and changing a life in the process. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. Sunlight pushed through the clouds, washing the hospital walls in gold. Daniel sat there for a long time, staring at the door where Rosa had stood. Her words echoed in his mind. "The only broken thing in this room is your love." He looked down at his hands, then at his legs, and whispered to himself, "Maybe I'm not broken after all." Some heroes wear capes, others carry mops. The weeks that followed were slow, painful, and filled with moments that tested Daniel's will to keep going. Each morning began the same way, a nurse rolling his wheelchair into the rehab center, the smell of antiseptic heavy in the air, and the sound of machines humming steadily in the background. But this time, Daniel wasn't the same man who had once stared hopelessly out that hospital window. Something inside him had shifted. Rosa's words had planted a seed, small, fragile, but unbreakable. He started therapy with trembling hands and a clenched jaw. Every stretch, every movement felt like fire under his skin. There were days he wanted to quit, when the pain screamed louder than his courage. But then he'd remember Rosa's voice, "You're stronger than you think." And somehow he'd push one more inch forward. Rosa still came by during her shifts. She never said much, a nod, a few quiet words, a smile that carried more encouragement than any speech ever could. Over time, they developed an unspoken friendship. She became his quiet anchor, the one person who believed in him when the world had turned away. Meanwhile, news of Alyssa's outburst in the hospital began to spread. Someone had recorded part of it. Her friends whispered, her followers disappeared, and the image she built so carefully, flawless, enviable, untouchable, began to crumble. But Daniel didn't care anymore. His focus had shifted from the woman who left him to the man he was becoming. He spent hours learning, researching, talking with other patients who had faced similar injuries. From those conversations, a new idea began to take shape. A foundation to support spinal injury survivors. A space for people who had lost everything to find themselves again. He called it the Rise Foundation. It started small, just a few members in a community hall. But within months, stories began to spread. Stories of hope, of recovery, of people standing tall again in their own ways. Daniel's determination became his testimony. His first steps weren't graceful, shaky, unsteady, and short-lived, but they were his. The room erupted in applause, but Daniel's eyes found Rosa's in the crowd. She simply smiled and nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. He didn't need validation. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He had already won the hardest battle, the one within himself. And in that moment, something extraordinary happened. The man who once believed his life was over realized it was only beginning. He stood, not because his body was healed, but because his spirit refused to stay on the ground any longer. When life knocks you down, the voice echoed softly, it's not about walking again. It's about rising. Months later, the lights of the city shimmered against the glass windows of the grand ballroom. Inside, the annual charity gala for the Rise Foundation was in full motion. Laughter, camera flashes, and the quiet hum of admiration filled the room. At the center of it all stood Daniel, not in a wheelchair, but on his own 2 feet, a simple cane in hand. His suit was sharp, his smile genuine, and his eyes, once dulled by pain, now carried the calm glow of someone who had made peace with his past. Reporters gathered around, eager to hear the story of the man who turned tragedy into purpose. Every question he answered came with humility. Every smile carried gratitude. Across the room, a familiar figure lingered, Alyssa. Her once confident posture now seemed hesitant, her eyes darting nervously through the crowd before finally landing on him. For a moment, she hesitated, clutching her glass like a shield. Then, slowly, she walked toward him. When their eyes met, there was no anger, only silence thick with unspoken memories. She looked at him, her voice trembling. You look good. Daniel turned, his expression kind but distant, a small, knowing smile tugging at his lips. I always did, he said softly. You just never saw me. Her lips parted, as if to reply, but no words came. The noise of the gala faded around them, replaced by the faint sound of soft instrumental music swelling in the background. Alyssa looked down, her eyes glistening, realizing that the man she had once abandoned no longer needed her. Not for love, not for closure, not for anything. He had built something far greater than what she had walked away from. As she quietly turned and disappeared into the crowd, Daniel exhaled, not in pain, but in peace. And then, near the back of the room, his eyes found Rosa. She stood there wearing a simple dress, holding a small bouquet of white lilies. Their eyes met, and in that brief glance a lifetime of gratitude passed between them. She smiled, the same calm, warm smile she'd given him on the hardest days, and nodded. Daniel raised his glass slightly in her direction. He didn't need to speak. She already knew. He thought losing her was the end, the voice echoed gently, but it was only the beginning. As the music swelled, Daniel turned back to the stage, surrounded by people who had found hope because he refused to give up. His journey, once marked by pain, now stood as proof that even broken things can be made beautiful again. And somewhere deep inside he whispered a quiet thank you to the woman who had left and to the woman who had stayed. In the end, Daniel's story wasn't about losing love. It was about finding something far greater. It was about courage born from heartbreak, hope born from despair, and the quiet strength that comes when the world turns its back and you stand anyway. Strength isn't measured in how far you walk, but in how hard you fight when everything seems lost. And sometimes the people the world overlooks become the ones who lift us the highest. Rosa never asked for credit. She never wanted praise or recognition, yet her words became the spark that reignited a man's will to live. Daniel's life became a testament to that truth, that sometimes the smallest voices leave the loudest echoes. His journey reminds us that compassion doesn't need to be grand or public. It just needs to be real. Sometimes the most powerful voice is the quietest one in the room. And maybe that's something we all need to remember. In a world full of noise, judgment, and haste, a little kindness, spoken softly, can change everything. So now I'll ask you, what would you have done in Daniel's place? Do you believe love should be unconditional? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if this story touched your heart, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe for more real, powerful stories every week. Because sometimes the stories we tell remind us who we truly are.